Hi, I'm David Fuller, and this is the Yacht Business Podcast. In this crossover episode, I chat with Justin Chisholm. Justin is a sailing journalist and host of the Yacht Racing Podcast. We discuss the way in which technology has impacted the sport of sailing from a media and communications point of view, and what might happen next.
So David Fuller, we're doing something a bit different this week. This is going to go out on both my podcast and your podcast. Let's start by just explaining who we are for our respective audiences. I'm Justin Chisholm. I'm a yachting journalist, and we've known each other for a little while now through various projects, our passion for sailing. And I've been running the Yacht Racing Podcast for, a few years now, kind of on and off, but gained a bit of momentum in the last year or so. So David, introduce yourself.
So I'm David Fuller. I'm a part-time sailing media person, I guess. I used to write quite a lot. I had a relatively successful blog called Yacht Sponsorship, which was focused on the commercial side of the sport, and that's kind of where I got in, how I got into it, and where I focused. I was much less about what the wind was blowing and who was first to the top mark, and a bit more around the commercial side. And I walked away from that for various reasons, and I guess we can get into that. And now I've restarted a new podcast, which I'm calling Yacht Business, which is focused on similar things, but I'm also looking at how emerging or disruptive technology impacts the space, the marine industry in general, but also professional sailing, which is how we got together and got to know each other.
You have a pretty strong technical background as well. Just talk a little bit about that, because I kind of regard you as a bit of a guru when it comes to blockchain and these various technologies that have emerged recently. And I consult with you fairly regularly to put me straight.
Yeah, so I guess digital technology as opposed to, materials technology or engineering technology, I certainly, can't compete with anyone who's talking about the nitty-gritty design paths of America's Cup boats, but certainly my background is marketing and business, and since the internet existed, since I saw that Mosaic first displayed at my university way back in the early 90s, I've had a passion for how digital technology can be used from a media point of view and from a communications, I guess generally from a communications point of view. So whether that means, social media, or whether that means a YouTube channel, or now, as you say, moving into more what they're now calling Web3, which is sort of blockchain and other technologies around that, whether it be the Internet of Things or 5G internet or machine learning or these types of digital technologies. That's kind of where I like to play.
things like that, things like the Metaverse. The last time we spoke was for you to kind of clue me in, I think, on the Metaverse and how that might affect things that were. I don't think we came to any strong conclusions, but that's a looming technology, isn't it?
The Metaverse is fairly ill-defined at the moment, and there's lots of people who have an idea as to what they think the Metaverse is. Originally, the word was coined by an author called Neal Stephenson, who mentioned the word first in a book called Snow Crash. And I don't think what his version of it was, even though he's building his own metaverse now, he's got his own company and is building his own version of the metaverse. So for some people, it's just a game. It's like an immersive VR game. For some people, it's a bit more like Second Life. I'm not sure if you ever come across that particular space, but as a virtual world that people could literally have a second virtual life. And for others, it's this. I guess the end goal is this sort of holodeck style reality where you exist in a 3D world, a bit like Ready Player One or the Star Trek holodeck. But we're nowhere near that yet. I think the metaverse right now is a sort of a mainly a gaming space. But there are some really interesting applications for it in education, and there's also some very interesting applications for it in the healthcare sector, and so I think there will be some user cases that will come to pass. How it relates to the marine industry, I'm really not too sure.
So here's my view of how it might exist, how I'd like it to evolve is I've worked a lot with the Ocean Race over the years, the Volvo Ocean Race as it was. We got very excited about 3D cameras on the boats that could give us this immersive view of what it was like to be blasting along on a Volvo 70 or a VO65 in the Southern Ocean and spray everywhere, and you could almost picture yourself standing in the cockpit. That's what I want the metaverse to do for me. I want to be on the back of that boat. I want to be standing next to Ben Ainsley on his AC-75 as he wins the next America's Cup. Is there any chance of that, do you think?
It could be possible, I guess. I don't know how you'd render it, but the graphics engines are getting better and better. I know that Volvo actually had a simulator, didn't they? One of these sort of capsules that you could get into, and it would spray water on your face and throw you around as you watch the film.
It was kind of like the Disney World experience or Warner Brothers experience, where you jump into the Back to the Future car and go zooming over buildings and stuff. Funnily enough, I never actually got in it, but people who did really enjoyed the experience. And it did used to like spray with a little water, but not quite like the fire hose in the cruise used to get, I suspect.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that's a possibility, but we're a way off, and the processing power probably needs to come up a bit. Most of the metaverses that are around at the moment are pretty clunky, low resolution, pixelated sort of experiences. You'll need 5G or better in order to stream something like the Volvo Ocean Race or the America's Cup in anything close to real time. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I think more interestingly, I've actually asked some questions around how weather in the metaverse would work. For example, whether it would even have weather, and if it did, what climate would you have? Does the whole metaverse have the same climate, or does it have the climate of where you are in the real world? There's some interesting questions around that. Although I know that there are scientific projects going on at the moment, that there's a digital twin of the oceans that I think the EU are trying to build. They're trying to, take data that's from the real world and mirror the oceans in order to, make simulations to predict what weather systems might look like in the future, or what marine life might look like in the future, or whether the seaweed will continue to grow or whether the fish will die and all that sort of stuff. So I think, again, if you take away the sort of consumer gaming element of some of these technologies and apply them specifically to research or something like that, then maybe a metaverse has more application for that. And maybe you know more about this than me, that I'm sure that the America's Cup teams are using simulators, aren't they?
They are, for sure. And that phrase digital twin, I want to come back to in a sec, because I hear that now a lot from the America's Cup teams from a design point of view when they're creating the boats. But David, I think we're maybe getting ahead of ourselves here. We've kind of leapt into the future. What we talked about doing was exploring a little bit just how technology has already influenced the sport of sailing, and I think we're really looking at the professional end of things here, because that's always been my focus. And one way that I saw it impact was when I sat down with the weather router for the Ocean Race, Gonzalo Infante, and I interviewed him for a piece about how do you plan the route of the next race, and they basically ran masses and masses and masses of simulations to try and make sure that the boats could arrive in a stopover port in a feasible timescale, because obviously there's forward planning that goes into all of these stopovers. And I imagine it was running on his laptop, but in reality, it was running on a massive I would have called it mainframe back in the day, but I guess it's a massive cloud of computing power that IBM were providing, and they'd actually bought, I think, at that stage, weather.com. And he said it just allowed him to do so much more and be so much more precise. Do you remember that happening? Or
there's a bunch of technologies that have enabled that, including IoT. So sensors, for example, have become a lot smaller and they use less battery power, so you can put more of them out there in more places. And again, satellite technology, the amount you can actually bring that data back from wherever it's being recorded, and so you have a lot more data, and you have a lot more tools to be able to process that data. I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or longer, you would have a number of very large, expensive weather stations that were collecting information and perhaps not being able to collate that in a way that all made sense. Whereas now, you've got thousands. I was talking to someone last week about a project called Yachts for Science, and there's 13,000 super yachts in the world. Now, each one of those super yachts has sensors on it that can, record or sense weather data. And if you can collate that, then suddenly you've got so many more data points than you used to. Or you've got history from the Sydney Hobart yacht race, or you've got history from the Round the World race, or you've got history from the record attempts. And you can put all that together into a model, and you've got a lot more, if you've got the processing power, as you say. You've got a lot more data points, and therefore, I guess you've got a much better accuracy for your forecasts.
Yeah, I think. Certainly, I was always amazed with the ocean race that Gonzalo was able to, give very accurate predictions of when boats were going to arrive into ports, even 2 weeks ahead of time. And I guess he was working with the polar. Guess it got easier with the advent of the one design boats, because then it was only one polar he was looking at for the VO65s, and that was the second race, I think. So it would be starting to get pretty accurate by that point. But what
I
was
think
really
that's kind of interesting. I remember listening to Russell Coutts talk about the giant trimaran that Oracle had, and I remember him telling a story of the engineers telling him that he wasn't going fast enough, that he was, that they knew exactly how fast the boat could go in a certain wind condition or a certain wave state, and he was sort of jokingly sort of saying that these engineers had never actually stepped foot on the thing, and they didn't realize just how scary it was as it creaked and got up to speed. Their model was telling them that he could push it further, and he was like, every bone in his body was saying, there's no way I can go any faster.
Yeah, I've got the reverse of that story, a personal sailing experience. Sailing at Cowes Week, the year that Silk did its massive nosedive. We had 50 knots of breeze while the fleet was out racing. And we were sailing a Humphreys 30, designed by Rob Humphreys, and he was on board. And we went round the windward mark, took off across the Solent with a reef in the main, which was the most reefs we could put in, the smallest headsail we had up. And I forget what speed we were doing, but we was a lot faster than we'd ever been. And he turned to me and he said, "It's not supposed to go this fast." I said, "Rob, that's not helpful right now." So that was the reverse.
Back when speed was determined by waterline length.
Absolutely. It was a fascinating, exciting day out. But just going back to Gonzalo, I mean, the significance of him being able to predict that accurately meant that it wasn't just convenient for everybody to know when the boats were coming in. The race organization were booking flights based on his information, were booking hotel rooms based on his information. So there was a risk to all this. There was a risk that the right people wouldn't be there if he got it wrong. So good use of that technology.
Well, I think that's also interesting in our field, sort of, to bring it round to the comms side of things and the media side of things. They must be using that type of predictive technology for TV schedules, for example. to know when to run a race so that it fits within the TV window, or if they know that the Sunday is going to be really calm, they'll bring it forward. And I'm thinking of something like SailGP here. I know that they've raced on a Friday and a Saturday, knowing that the wind is not necessarily going to be there on the Sunday. So these types of predictions and forecasts impact every aspect of the show.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right about SailGP. There's probably a few people listening who will moan and groan about SailGP's ability or inability to get that right. There's been a few occasions, I think, where in Denmark there was no racing on the Saturday and nobody could understand why they didn't go to the Friday, and but it's more complicated than just that.
So you say I was an early adopter, but I think you're more of an early adopter than me when it comes to some of these things. So you had a podcast really early on. You've dabbled with things like e-magazines on iPads. You've played around with all kinds of different media to get to your audience. So go back to how has it? So how's the podcasting changed since the really early days when you were doing it?
Well, I think let me answer a different question first of all. I think my job as a sailing journalist, the way I do my job has changed dramatically since I kind of reinvented myself a long time, 20 odd years ago, as a sailing journalist. And back then, you could, if you were good enough, you could pitch a magazine editor, of which there were plenty, and say, hey, I'm thinking about going to cover the Melges 24 Worlds. It's going to be down at Key West. And you could get a commission from them, which would pay enough to fly out there, stay in a hotel, not a particularly swanky one, cover the event, and still make some money out of it. Now, those days changed pretty quickly. The magazine industry globally has taken a massive hit, and there are so few sailing magazines left now, and the ones that pay any money are even fewer. So that meant a complete switch around for me, that I needed to be able to interview people, not so much cover events, but I needed to be able to interview the key players in the sport. And of course, the advent of things like Skype, and we're going back a long way here, but it kind of changed everything, because suddenly I could interview Russell Coutts in New Zealand when I was sitting at home in the UK, and I could write those stories, and it immediately changed just everything. So I think that even those kind of what we regard now as basic technologies have made a big change to the way sailing communications works. And it's obviously not just me. Everybody has been able to benefit from that. But certainly, yes, I'm a bit of a techie geek. I love my gadgets. I loved the iPad when it came out. I loved the iPhone too. I love the idea of podcasting. And I kind of wanted into all of that. So yeah, the podcast came first, which I did with a friend and colleague of mine, Andy Rice, which I'm sure listeners will know from his various writings and websites and whatever. And we started a podcast called Sailing Talk, and it was just the two of us talking for 15 minutes each week, and just what did we think? We would pick a topic and we would talk about it, maybe an event that just happened, maybe somewhere we'd been. David, whether anybody ever listened to it, I have no idea, because back then you really had no statistics.
Right.
And we did it really as a calling card. It was a business card for us to say, hey, we're two sailing journalists, and we kind of think we know what we're talking about enough to do this. And again, whether that ever benefited us, I'm not entirely sure. The iPad magazine was a really interesting thing for me, and I was in disbelief that when the iPad came out and the technologies emerged, that somebody like me could produce an interactive magazine on the iPad, and everything on the iPad was cool back then, right? It all looked fantastic. The photographs looked amazing because the resolution was better than anything else at that point. And I was able to do it. And I thought, it can't be just me. There must be, all of these big magazines must be doing exactly what I'm doing. And I spoke to Matt Sheehan one day and I showed him what I was producing, and he burst out laughing and he said, I've been trying to persuade Yachting World to do this for years, and you're going to steal a march on everybody. You're gonna. So my idea, I know I'm talking a lot here, but my idea was to be less of a writer and more of an editor, and I recruited Bob Fisher and Andy Rice and a few other of the sailing journalists, and they wrote monthly columns for me.
I think I even wrote you something once in the back of the day.
You absolutely did, yeah. You wrote on the business side of things. So two things I learned from it. One, it was incredibly popular. We had 100,000 downloads of the app, which is, even by today's standard, is a huge take up. That's when it was a free magazine,
right?
And I tried various models of monetizing it through advertising and then through charging a subscription. And the reality is that I think it probably is possible to monetize that, but as a single individual trying to do everything, the workload was just too high.
Yeah, because I think even though the technology has moved on in many places, creating original content, good original content, is still time consuming and expensive and hard.
Yeah, it is, and in the world that I wanted to play in the leaning towards the professional end of things, finding the people to write for you that are expert enough to do it and being able to afford them is an expensive. So that was Sail Racing Magazine, and it lasted a few years. I had a few stumbles and restarts on it, and eventually decided to pull the plug, largely because I was offered roles with the Ocean Race and the America's Cup and various other things that were, as a freelancer, the temptation to take a regular decent payment is, you got to pay the bills, you got to pay the mortgage and put food on the table. So, but I don't regret doing it, and I think it was well received at the time.
So I think that was the hardest part of all of this was the business model. There was the professional sailing fan base is not massive. It's you look at all the social media likes, and I think you're lucky if you're getting into the hundreds of thousands. It's certainly still a niche sport, and from that point of view, there's also a limited number of advertisers. There's a limited number of watch companies or bits. So the advertising model is sort of tough, especially if you're coming to it new, like I was. I mean, you at least had some track record and reputation, whereas when I started my first blog, I was completely unknown, and I had traffic, but I didn't have. The way the advertising model worked was that it was based on views and numbers rather than the quality of the people who are looking at the site. And that was one of the reasons that I stopped it, just because I couldn't make it work from a business model point of view. And I think that has changed in the last few years, with whether it's Patreon or whether it's some other type of donation mechanic, or whether it's some sort of subscription mechanic. That's now everyone has Apple Pay, and everyone's used to paywalls because everyone from the New York Times to the FT has now got a paywall. So it was assumed by many fans that the content we were producing should be free. They weren't necessarily in a place to pay for it. Whereas I think that's changed now, and there are more people who are willing to pay a couple of bucks here or there, or to subscribe for a few pounds a month to get access to the content that they want. Have you found is that ring true for you as well?
Yes, and I think you said something interesting. You said it was niche. Sailing's niche, and what I've learned is that niche can be good.
Yeah,
because niches are where people have passion for something. And when they have passion for it, if they're getting good content, they're often willing to pay for it. Whereas I think the more general you go, the more mainstream you go, then people, they don't have that passion. It's too broad. So that's certainly what I've been focusing on recently. I mean, the Yacht Racing Podcast is an unashamedly me interviewing people that I find interesting in the sport. And I don't, there are certain people who I've not interviewed, and it's because I just don't think they're going to be an interesting interview. And it's not because they haven't done anything interesting. Often they have, but some people, they're just not good with interviews and
right.
personality wise, and it's kind of unfair to ask them to do it.
Sure.
But that's been extremely well received. Again, I've explored charging for it. I've given in and gone back to a free model, and I guess it's my kind of my contribution to the sailing communication world is we're gonna put that out there. And it was interesting. I mean, it was a good year or so after I started that Shirley Robertson and Tim Butt started with their podcast, and Tim said, "Oh, we're going into competition with you," and I said, "There is no competition in this market. It's the more people who are doing this at a high level, at a decent level, the better, because then
absolutely.
People get used to the idea of sailing podcasts. Just because somebody listens to mine doesn't mean they won't listen to yours, and vice versa. They almost certainly will listen to both.
And it's a different style. I mean, I don't listen to it all the time, but I occasionally listen to Barkarati, which is the three guys in Australia, which is a very different podcast altogether because it's three hosts and they're talking about the Australian market a lot more than sailing. It's got a completely different season. It happens in December in in Sydney Harbour, not in May.
And I love the fact that those guys, and I know all three of them, I love the fact that they're doing that because that's a bit more, that's what sailing didn't really have. It's a bit more like the traditional podcast, mainstream podcast model where it's a group of guys kind of bantering. And I think it's great because we didn't have that before. Alan Block probably was the closest to it with his, I don't know whether he did call it Sailing Anarchy or whether it was the Alan Block podcast. And that was a bit more like that. It was a bit more free form. But yeah, I've adopted a model where I just interview them. I do very little editing. If I only edit out coughing fits or occasionally if somebody swears, and I think I've got to be careful with Apple Podcasts because I'm not. I don't want to get tagged as adult only content because I'm sure we have some younger listeners, but I don't do a massive amount of editing. I let the interviews. I put the effort into making the interviews strong on the day by preparing the right questions and researching the guests. And I think that's what Shirley does really well with her podcast as well.
There's still a lack of diversity in the comms, isn't there? I mean, there's mostly white guys that are in this business. There's a few women, but there used to be Pierre, had his blog in Spain, and that was incredibly popular
sailing,
just because it was, for a different language in different languages and whatever else. France, I guess there's a lot of coverage. I don't speak French, so I don't listen to any of that or watch any of that.
Well, the guys have done well in France with the Tip and Shaft podcast. That's an unfortunate name, but they created a newsletter model before really I'd even heard of the newsletter model, and it's very brief. It's just headlines really more than anything else. It's, I would imagine, relatively easy to create on a weekly basis because there's a little bunch of them. Whether they're making a success out of it financially, I really don't know because how could you know? All of us are quite secretive about that sort of stuff. They seem to have a good subscriber base because it says at the bottom how many subscribers there are.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast. We are now available on all platforms, including Apple. Also, check out some of the other podcasts we've mentioned. Justin's Yacht Racing Podcast, Barkarati, Shirley Robertson's Sailing Podcast, and support the community. Let us know if there's others we've missed. Well, I think the thing that really pushed changed the game for people like us was social media, in the sense that you could suddenly get distribution a lot more easily than you used to be able to. I mean, driving traffic to a website was always expensive or hard. The discovery was relatively difficult for people to discover new media or new sites. social media, and I started my blog around the same time that Twitter started, and built a massive following on Twitter, which enabled me to effortlessly sort of send out a ping that said, "Hey, there's a new article up on the website," or there's a new piece of content out there. And that model worked incredibly well in terms of building understanding who the sailing audience was. And I guess it also was a massive boon for rights holders who could suddenly talk directly to their fans without having to go through the magazines or the newspapers or the TV stations, or hoping that, they get picked up by the news. They could just open the channel directly to the fans, which was a game changer.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we're seeing more and more of now with things like Substack, which is a newsletter stroke website platform that allows writers of any genre to be able to connect directly with an audience and to monetize it really easily. They have a payment system built into the whole thing. And that's the route I've gone down with a website newsletter called Cup Insider about the America's Cup, and the same thing for SailGP, another one called SGP Insider. And, really, again, I think sometimes the trick is being the first one to do it. And I think I am the first one on Substack. I did notice that Richard Gladwell has his own site set up. It's not active yet, but Richard from Sail World, who I have a huge amount of respect for. So I think people are going to cotton on to that as well. But maybe being the first one in is a help. Because the goal
is there a subscription or a charge for that as a content creator?
They take a little fee that you don't pay anything to them directly. They take a fee from.
It's a commission. If you're getting subscriptions, they're taking a thing. I've never liked those sites just because I like having control of my content, and so I have and I'm technically proficient enough to be able to run my own websites and build my own websites. So if I can control the domain and the SEO and keep control of the content, then I prefer that than a model like Substack. But
which I would agree with you, but you're a bit of a rare case in that you've got that technical knowledge, and I just don't, and it's expensive to find, and it's time consuming, and the thing I like about these models is it just lets you write. You focus on the writing. But what I've also found is that you write in a slightly different way because you are writing for an audience of people who have subscribed either for free or as a paid subscription. And you feel that kind of personalizes it. You feel a responsibility towards them. I think sometimes you write a bit more often and longer than you might do normally.
Yeah. Well, my old site, I used to know the people who read it by name. I mean,
exactly.
So I was almost writing directly to a certain person when I was editorializing about someone I had in mind who was reading it.
Absolutely. And I mean, I get an email every time somebody signs up, and I always open the email and look. I mean, 9 times out of 10, I don't know who it is. But I don't know. It's interesting to me just to see that.
Given that sailing is something that people are passionate about, why is there not more YouTube channels or more Substacks or more TikToks around sailing? Is it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I mean, Matt Sheehan's doing really well with his Planet World YouTube channel. Again, we don't know how much he's been able to monetize that, but I understand he's certainly working really hard on it, and he's got, from what I can see, a high subscriber base for sailing in YouTube terms generally. I don't think it's going to break any records, and that that's a kind of highly professionally produced channel. And then you've got other people, like there's a guy that's on Sailing Anarchy a lot.
Mozzy's just restarted his channel.
Mozzy
I think 12
Sails,
days ago.
yeah.
He's just restarted his YouTube channel. So,
yeah, which is
interestingly enough, now if you can hover hover over the bottom of the video and you can see where people are tuning in and tuning out.
Right.
Which I did for SailGP the other day. It's quite interesting. You get this huge spike at the start of the race and then nothing, and then another spike at the start of the next race and then nothing.
Yeah,
it's
that's what I've heard. And I mean, I think with the Mozzy Sails thing, it's interesting. I mean, he's something like 18,000 subscribers on his YouTube channel, which it's not.
I think you've got to carve out something different. Right, and he's done that. He's focusing on the engineering, technical design piece, which a lot of people love geeking out on. Even I, who don't necessarily understand it, I still like to geek out on some of the videos that he does because I find them really, really interesting. Again, the reason I did mine because I know the commercial side. That's why I can write about the commercial side, because that's what I'm into. But you can only have so many generic stories, and to a certain degree, even though you and Shirley are very different and your podcasts are very different, there's only so many people that you can talk to without hearing John Bertrand's story again, or Nick
absolutely absolutely
or Ben Ainsley's story again, or someone else's story again. It's the origin story over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. And I get an email from Shirley when she's produced an episode, and I see who it is, and I'm like, oh, well, I need to cross them off the list of people I was going to interview, because that's a waste of time. You can't do that for another couple of years at least. So what's interesting about the podcast is, though, I mean, I think I've got 60 episodes up right now. And even though I haven't put an episode out, this will be the first one for a little while. The take-up's still really strong on the back issues, on the previous editions, which I think it makes me happy, because I tried to make them timeless. I mean, other than the Vendée Globe things I did with Conrad Coleman, everything else you could listen to it at any point and it would still be pretty relevant, because it's just stories about how people came into the professional sailing world. So that's pleasing. I want to quiz you on digital twin. Can you give us a 1-minute explanation or shorter of what a digital twin is?
Yeah,
it's going to be big in the America's Cup.
Yeah, so a digital twin is kind of what it sounds like. It's a virtual or digital model of a physical thing. So, for example, if you have a boat, and I had a really interesting podcast a couple of weeks ago with a guy called Jonny Dodge, who is in the super yacht business, but he was talking about how there's a yacht yard, St. Lorenzo, I think he said, that build big super yachts. They have now in their shipyard an enormous green screen building, green walls, and they put the VR goggles on the face of the buyer, of the owner, and they walk them through a 3D real scale model of the boat before it's ever built. So they can see where things are how they're laid out, and you can see how big the master cabin is, and you can work it all out. Literally walk through a 3D replica of the boat before it's ever been built, which saves a lot of money and time and money. If you build a twin of your boat, in a digital world, and you can put it into a physics engine, apply gravity, apply friction, apply whatever the forces are to it, and then you can tinker with it. Yeah, so it's basically a model, a simulated 3D digital model of a real world thing. The cool one now is what they're talking about is a digital triplet. And so a digital twin is an absolute mirror of the physical thing. The digital triplet now is got a machine learning AI attached to it that learns from the twin, so that the triplet kind of watches the twin and then suggests changes based on a machine learning AI model, and then that can be then applied to the twin, and then that could be applied to the physical thing. It's
where is that being used? Probably outside of sailing. Where is that evolved from? That
So it's like manufacturing systems, for example. So what they're calling it, manufacturing 4.0 or industry 4.0. So yeah, for example, if you've got a production line, you've got your physical production line in the factory, and then you've got your your digital twin of the production line, so you can see that running. And then you create the triplet, which basically the machine learning watches the digital twin and says, oh, actually, I'm going to see what happens if I take 3 people off this production line for 10 minutes and then see what happens. Or I'm going to add, a new machine to this production line and see what happens. So if you're designing processes that have variables, and again, sailboats have a lot of variables, but if you can add or take away, change the conditions in the triplet as a kind of but I'm not explaining it very well, but it has this element of machine learning and AI attached to it, whereas the digital twin is more of I'll make me as a human being will make a change in the digital twin to see what happens. But
yes.
the triplet is actually an artificial intelligence machine learning doing that change as opposed to a human.
Now you've mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning, but I just wanted to flag it up as a cool technology that's been used in the marine world. So the company was originally called Oscar, and it's just changed into SEA.AI. That's the name of the company, CAI. And this is a company that produces the kit that the IMOCA boats used in the Vendée Globe to look ahead of them during the day and at night and spot objects in the water, which the skipper, even if he was looking out 24 hours a day, might not be able to spot. So it's
not a container or a whale.
Absolutely, and that's exactly the example they use. And there's some fantastic testimonies from Jean Le Cam and people like that who helped develop the whole thing. So it's kind of what we always said, like, isn't there a system where these boats can stop running into things? Because this seems crazy. Well, now the technology seems to have caught up with that, and of course it can be applied to super yachts. It can be applied to any vessel now. But what was interesting for me was that the fact that it's learning from every time a system is installed. As I understand it, what that system learns gets fed back into the total system.
Right. So the more times it sees a whale, the more times it says that is a whale. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, it's probably an interview I need to do, or maybe you need to do further down the line, and just find out, like, how did they build the database that it's running from now? Because you look at the Google cars, we all know they spent a long time teaching them traffic lights and various other things, pedestrians and pedestrian crossings.
Yes. Very interesting. Although I think it can go too far. I don't know what your thoughts are on the new AC40 that seems like it could basically be sailed by remote control.
Yeah, I've talked to a few people about this, including some America's Cup sailors, and I think what you're talking about is the video that the Emirates Team New Zealand produced with Nathan Outridge, basically talking us through how this AC40 works. And of course, we get excited and say, all right, well, yeah, sit in the cockpit, show me what's in the cockpit. And it was kind of just a set of buttons. It was a steering wheel and a set of buttons. And I still think the boat is ultra cool, and I love everything that's going on with the foiling monohulls. But I was a bit, there are no ropes on this boat at all. And it just kind of brought it home for me that, it's become a push button sport at that level. So,
yeah.
What was your thought?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think if you could basically just, as I say, sail it via remote control. You wouldn't even have to have a skipper necessarily on board. They do drone racing these days, so I'm sure you could do remote control boats. Although that's been around for a long time as well, remote control boats, remote control sailboats.
Well, the other big area of this is that's probably contentious and will aerate the social media channels is the ocean race. The IMOCA's now fully crewed, which is only 4 people, but that's what fully crewed is these days. But the boats will largely be steered by Auto-Helm. So they're foiling boats, they're traveling at high speed, in the right conditions. And it's a big departure for the race to to allow auto-helms. And originally they weren't going to do it. The auto-helms were going to be there for use when you were doing sail changes, so just a heading control. But now they've adopted what was developed for the Vendée Globe, these highly sophisticated robot systems, as the skippers are now calling them, that can steer the boat pretty much as well as a human can. And Will Harris, who's sailing with Boris Herman on the Militia project, he said that there will be somebody with the auto-helm control in their hand, and that is what will pass for helming the boat during this race. So it's interesting, and I guess the point is that the boats are so high performance now that that's what you have to do.
You could probably get to a point where you'd say that an auto-helm would be better than a human. Because it just can process a lot more data a lot more quickly. The human brain's not very good at that sort of thing. So if you've got IoT sensors on the tips of the foils and on the tips of the rudders and on the top of the mast, and you've got all that data being fed into a robot that's saying, well, I'm going to correct by half a degree that a human probably can't even work it out. On a wheel or a tiller, how much to correct without having overcorrecting and undercorrecting. So
absolutely, and in the Vendée Globe, I mean, the auto-helm steers about 95% of the race. That was a big shock to me when I found that out a few years ago. But the systems are so advanced now that they absolutely can steer way better than the sailors, and especially over prolonged periods. The sailors are really there as caretakers of the boat, I think, in the Vendée, which is I'll probably get a slap from one of the skippers for saying that, but essentially they're there to do all the stuff that a robot couldn't.
Interesting. Yeah, it does. It does. It does bring it into question. Why you're doing it, right?
Yeah.
Why people are following it.
Well, that's right. And it'll be interesting to see this time around what the response of the sailing public is to these IMOCA boats where the crews are enclosed. Kind of getting off our technological topic a little bit there, but let me drag it back then.
I think that machine learning for auto-helms is definitely the sort of technology that'll impact the sport as well. But
yeah, you and I have talked about DAOs, and I've forgotten what it is. Something autonomous,
decentralized autonomous organization.
Yeah, so DAOs are a big thing. It's all linked in with blockchain, but we're going to have a DAO sailing team in SailGP if we believe their marketing hype. I know you're cynical, so
I'm not cynical. I think the idea of an idea of a team that's owned by the fans is a pretty cool idea. The ultimate DAO is actually a sailing club. It's not a new idea, right? A sailing club is effectively a DAO. It's got members. It's got a committee that's voted for by the members. It's an entity that is, sort of got a democratic structure to it, and operates to a constitution or a set of policies. So there are real world facsimiles of DAOs. The difference with the DAO, which I think is a bunch of techies looking for a solution, is that why does it have to be in the blockchain? There are real world facsimiles, and I'm really not sure why you couldn't do it in a non-blockchain environment. There's nothing stopping you building a team that would be owned by the fans in a traditional sort of thing. The only thing that blockchain technology really brings to a DAO is the concept of anonymity, and so basically you can be an identity on the blockchain and participate in an organization without necessarily being known who you are. But there's a lot of fine print that I don't understand about the SailGP one, for example. It's what decisions exactly would the DAO holders be allowed to make? It's based on NEAR protocols. So I'm assuming you need to hold the NEAR token in order to participate. And does that mean that if somebody has 80% of the tokens, they get 80% of the votes? In which case, it's not. What's the point?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a lot of question marks around it. Not necessarily cynical, skeptical, shall we say?
Skeptical. There we go. We'll go for skeptical. But it seems like a good way of raising money, doesn't it? I mean, potentially you could raise a lot of money very quickly for a SailGP team.
Yes. Again, you've got to work out whether or not there's any overlap between the people who have blockchain or cryptocurrency wallets and understand how loading a cryptocurrency wallet using normal dollars or pounds or euros into that wallet, then converting it to a near token, and then investing that into joining a DAO via Discord. It's an incredibly complicated and technical user journey. And whether or not the fans of SailGP match the people who are comfortable with that user journey remains to be seen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love the fact that they're trying it. It's great that it's our sport that's trying these sort of things, and we can be skeptical. I agree. We shouldn't be cynical. I think we're trying to stay away from that. I think
golf is trying a similar kind of thing. I think there's a golf token and a sort of a golf blockchain golf club. And I'd be surprised if maybe some of the football clubs would be looking into it, but every single Formula One team has a crypto partner. There's certainly a lot that's going on in that space. Again, probably not the cryptocurrency side, but more of the blockchain side. Yeah, so it's a technology that's certainly going to impact in ways we probably haven't even considered or thought of yet. Yeah. Okay, no, so I was going to say that I think, one of the things that technology changed from a media side of things was somebody didn't have to have the investment of starting a magazine or a printing press or having to buy a broadcasting license. Anybody could suddenly become a media personality or an influencer, blogger, however you want to define that. Well, when I started my blog, there were certain rights holders that wouldn't recognize me as media. I had to say that I was working for the Times, or I had to say that I had a credential, or they wanted to know how many millions of people were looking at my website before they'd offer me a pass to the media center. And that slowly changed around that period. Certain rights holders, I think people like the Extreme Sailing series looking forward sort of said, this is the future. This is the way we're going to get our message out there, is via these independent social media or bloggers. Certainly they were the first series that gave me credentials. It took the America's Cup a little bit longer. I'm not sure what your experience of that was like.
Yeah, I kind of went at it a slightly different way in that I had written part-time for some of the magazines for a couple of years. So I was lucky enough to have the body of work, not that it was a big body of work, that I could, I applied for a Yachting Journalists Association membership and got that. And once you've got that, accreditation gets a lot easier for sure. But yeah, I do remember early on struggling a little bit for credibility, which I think is fair. It's interesting to me that, just going back to Mozzy Sails, he's been given access, and I think quite rightly, for the America's Cup Recon Cloud, which is a kind of limited number of media outlets have been given access to that. That only came about really because he wrote a rant on the Sailing Anarchy forum about, basically how crap it was and how disappointed he was in the whole thing. And I think somebody approached him and said, well, you're only seeing a tiny fraction of it, and why don't you have a look? And of course, then he said, well, I've been given access now, and look, it's actually really cool. There's a lot of stuff on here. It just needs to be curated, which I think is a fair point. And he's going to do hopefully a good job of doing that. But he's a part timer, and this is, should we be limiting these things to people who are full time and doing it professionally? I don't know what the answer to that is. I suspect as long as the quality is high and consistent, then you leave them to it. Yeah,
if he's got an audience, and then why not, gets it out there. Yeah, absolutely.
It reminds me a little bit of the complaint from all of my photographer friends, because when I first started in this business, I made a point of making friends with the photographers, because as much as I'm pride myself on being a good writer. A good photo with your piece will enhance it massively. So, but they all complain that everybody's got a digital camera now. Like, everybody thinks they're a photographer. I guess it's a little bit the same as everybody's got a computer, everybody's got a keyboard, everybody thinks they can write. I think the number of people taking photographs has dropped off dramatically because that's a difficult game to make any serious money in.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess again, the business models have changed enormously as well. So, again,
yeah.
You used to have this concept of, if it's on the front cover of a big magazine and you got paid a certain amount, and is the hero image on the top of a blog article, worth the same? It's a really interesting question, which I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to. Yeah,
I think the way that whole photography model has changed is you're right. It used to be the cover shots, and now what you find is there's probably 5, or maybe, if we're being generous, 10 photographers out there who are hired by the organization of the America's Cup, the Ocean Race, whatever it is. And part of their role is to distribute those images make them as widely available as possible.
Yeah.
So on a regular basis, I get a link sent to me in the email to Carlo Bolinghi's photos, or any number of the other photographers whose names have immediately gone out of my head now I'm recording a podcast. But why would I consider paying for them? I mean, I'm getting them for free. Slightly different for the magazines, I think, but the model's just changed completely. All right, well, David, I think it's been interesting. Hopefully the listeners do too. It's a little bit of a departure for us to do this kind of cross-pollination.
A crossover episode.
yeah, it's been fun for me. So let's leave it at that. David, thanks a million for joining me, and I hope your audience enjoys hearing from me, and I'm sure my audience will enjoy hearing from you.
That's great, Justin. It's been a real pleasure. That's it for this episode. Let us know what you think about some of the issues discussed. If there's no driver, is it a sport? Where is the next generation of sailing influencers coming from? Find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Should we have a Discord server as well?